How's it going, everyone? It's Ken from Pixelated Thoughts, and in this video we are going to rank all of the story bosses in the First Berserker. The caveat is that I will not be ranking them in terms of difficulty, but rather pain, meaning how annoyed was I during these fights. The First Berserker is a bit of a different Souls-like with how lengthy some of these fights can be and how every boss's second or third phase can completely change the way you approach the fight entirely. Obviously, there are going to be spoilers as I am going through every major fight, so if there is a boss you haven't fought yet, don't watch the video. With that being said, let's dive in. At number 16, it's Yeta. There's not much to really say about this fight. It's a really good first boss, kind of gets you to understand just how certain fights are going to operate. Very much more methodical, slower paced until you get to that second phase when I think he starts to ramp up its attacks, and I was really enjoying that last part of the fight because the first part was just kind of waiting for small openings here and there and then exploring them where I could. Yeah, the footage you're seeing is from New Game Plus because I totally forgot to record this, but I think this is a good start, and I wasn't really annoyed when fighting through this boss. Next up is Volbaino. I really can't pronounce these names, but I think that this fight was a lot of fun. The only issue is that if you didn't understand the second phase gimmick, when he starts to go insane, the nail starts to get really heated up, and he starts to do flame damage everywhere, and then he starts to drive the nail down, and it can do concussive damage, and then eventually, when he gets very frustrated and really entering that last part of the fight, he can make an entire arena explode. Now, if you weren't paying attention, especially in the beginning of that second phase when he climbs up and then jumps straight down at you, that's your cue to know that once he starts to light the arena on fire, you need to get to the second level, otherwise you will die. This is not a hard fight, really easy reads, really fun. I love the fact in the second phase he can throw the nail at you, and if you happen to get aggressive to thinking that, well, maybe I can exploit him with just his hammer, don't do that, because his hammer phase is actually faster and more devastating. Just wait for him to pick up the nail, and then afterwards, it's really easy work. At number 14, we have Shataka. So here's what I've learned. Bosses that have a lot of size in this game are actually the easiest to manage, and this boss is no different. Wide sweeps, pretty easy attacks to read. I was kind of confused at first with some of the burst attacks because it did take a little bit of timing to get down, but beyond that, this took me like 1 or 2 tries. I was kind of shocked about how easy this boss was. I thought I was being punked. Most bosses at that point had a vastly different second phase, but this one was really, he just gets a plague hand and then swings that at you, and you can actually bait that into eventually going away, and then the fight just continues. Very weird fight because I just expected more. And then the different openings that you can exploit, like almost every other attack, Shataka will fall down, and then from there you can just punish. I was kind of confused. I'm serious. I really thought this was going to be a really annoying fight. I didn't really like how small the arena was compared to the size of Shataka, but this is a really easy fight, and I actually had a really good time beating him up. You know, whatever. At number 13, we have Hismar. The name doesn't matter, and let me tell you why. It's just a big dragon, but a surprisingly simple fight. I was not annoyed at all. I was concerned when I first saw this dragon. I thought to myself that I'm probably going to be unprepared, that this is going to be a really fast, frantic fight. You could really only target its arms and its head, and you only really want to target its head because that's where you're going to do most of the posture damage. And the weird thing is that I kind of expected more. This was kind of a disappointing fight for me in regard to the endgame stuff because I really expected this to be like this big, epic brawl, but instead, it's just a couple of simple swipes down, a couple of dive bomb attacks, hit the head a couple times, repeat. The only time that this boss is really threatening in its second phase is when it dive bombs with its chaos hand. That chaos attack can kill you in 1 strike. However, if you do happen to parry it or dodge out of the way in time, you can do enough damage to its head to knock him down, and then afterwards just beat the absolute crap out of him. It's kind of a really weird fight, honestly. I just thought, big dragon, you have a background with this dragon. This was going to be an epic, large-scale brawl, really cool second phase. Instead, kind of basic. But I will say I do appreciate the reprieve you're given before you actually go into the last 2 fights, which can be pretty difficult. Next up, let's talk about the Blade Phantom. This is a fun fight, but not a back-breaking challenge. And here's the thing. I really feel like this fight sets you up for failure, and let me explain. Because this is the fight where You have so many easy openings to exploit, and this is a multi-phase fight with a boss who carries multiple weapons and has a pretty heavy tool set. But what's interesting is that the damage output that this boss is doing is not particularly high, and that's probably by design because you don't have that many skill points and you're probably still trying to get your feelers in for this game. But here, it feels like you're doing far more damage than you should. It feels like they're not doing enough damage, even to your own stamina. And I was kind of curious to see, like, well, maybe this is going to be an easier Souls-like because both the Yeti and the Blade Phantom were a bit on the easy side. And usually with Souls-likes, they like to set the tone a bit with some of the bosses. And we'll get to Viper in a bit, but I really feel like the Blade Phantom, for the most part, just a really fun fight. Not stressful at all. Only took me a couple of tries. At number 11, we have Bararan, and I have a question for everyone out there is, do you like the chase? Because you're going to have to be aggressive in this fight. There are two gimmicks at play here with Bararan. One, after a certain period of time, she will summon a shield around herself, and you can interrupt that by attacking. Two, she can also summon a Reaper, and you really need to prevent her from doing that. As long as she does not reach that max skull limit above her head when she begins that summon circle, you're going to be okay because most of the other summons are easy to dodge and get around, and eventually they will disappear. But the Reaper is essentially a mini boss fight in the middle of a boss fight, which is somehow meta and also very annoying. So I get why the developers pretty much wanted to teach you a lesson, but unless you learn that immediately that you can interrupt Bararan, you are going to have a really difficult time. Otherwise, this fight's really manageable, not that annoying. I just don't like the fact that after every few hits, she just dashes away. That can be pretty annoying, but beyond that, it's a really simple fight. Just make sure you get out of the way of the AoE attacks because they'll do status effects and high damage. Really fun fight, though. At number 10, we have Princess Ilyna. Now, the only reason that this fight is annoying to me is because of how often she dashes away after some of these thrust attacks. Now, when you first go through this fight, you'll notice that these thrust attacks aren't that threatening. They don't do enough damage to stamina. However, she does go into a multi-thrust attack, which I think is like 7 or 8, followed up with this like really hard lunge, which if you block, you will open her up to damage. My suggestion for this fight, for anyone who's going through it, just kind of be aggressive, but be smart about the openings, because when you get to that second phase, that's where things kind of get dicey, primarily because of all the chaos magic. I really love the fact, though, that she summons an audience to watch her cast this magic. It's a very cool thing, but it's also really annoying because if you're not used to that second phase aesthetic where she starts throwing all these different projectiles, stuff that can chase you, you really want to get behind this boss as often as possible to do big damage. You've got to break down their posture. And like every human boss, you're going to want to break their stamina as quickly as possible. Otherwise, you're going to elongate the fight. I really enjoyed this fight, but at the same time, I was annoyed by how often she dodged away. At number 9, we have Rangkus, aka Discount Mr. Torque, and this is the first human boss that can recover their stamina on their own, so you cannot let them get too far away from you. I didn't find this fight annoying at first until we got into the second phase, until he went batshit insane and just starts throwing all these different flame attacks at you. And when that second phase happens, it's such a change up from the first phase, because almost everything in that first phase is readable, whether it's him shooting multiple arrows at you, whether it's him dashing at you, going ahead with that overhead attack. Almost all of it easily readable. But here in the second phase, he has a dashback ability in which he fires his gun so quickly that it's really difficult to manage because you can't really get that tell down until you're a couple fights in. And I really wanted to love this fight, but I ended up getting really annoyed because some of the attacks were just like, dude, you can come in and be a little closer to me, you know? Don't make me dash to you constantly. And the fact that, like all human bosses, once they get into that, like, walking backwards motion, for some reason they recover stamina so quickly, and they can also kind of quickly dodge away, which is also really annoying. I, for whatever reason, just do not like most of the human fights in this game because it feels like you're chasing to do enough stamina damage while they're walking backwards or recovering, and you're just not doing enough damage in return, and that can be frustrating. But here, it's mostly due to the second phase and the different flame attacks that he throws out. Very annoying. Really fun first phase. Second phase, though, can be pretty stressful. At number 8, we have Reese. So the first phase of this fight is really interesting because it's like a laser light show. Reese tries to kind of keep their distance from you. They throw out all these different magical attacks. When I first fought this boss, I did not know that you could really deflect projectiles back at them, which was really cool when I found that out because it does break stamina very quickly. I felt like the first phase gave me problems though because once you break her stamina down the first time, she will gain a shield. Once she gains a shield, then the fight kind of becomes problematic because you're just not doing enough damage. And because of all the different magical attacks, the barriers she sets up, the different projectiles she's just throwing at you at all times, I really feel like it was frustrating until you get to the second phase. Now, the second phase is kind of daunting because it's a complete change up. It's essentially all physical attacks with varying speeds. But after a while, the second phase becomes really readable, and I really enjoyed that part of the fight. And even though she does have a number of projectiles that she throws at you, and she does kind of go batshit crazy at the end because she will put 4 barriers up to attack you, I really feel like when I was fighting through this boss, the first phase was annoying, just pretty much because of all the chasing I had to do. The second phase was kind of easy because she's aggressive and wants to get in front of you. And then that little last part of her health bar in the second phase where she kind of goes crazy, throws all the different chaos attacks at you. She has projectiles thrown at you before she attacks, so that can kind of throw you off. But it's actually really simple to break down her posture and her stamina. So I really like the fight. I just didn't really like the first phase. But still not that annoying. Coming in at number 7 is Trokka, I don't care. Here's the thing. The witch runs away from you and does have some pretty easy openings. The issue is physical attacks from her do not do a lot of damage. Magical attacks will absolutely devastate you. What's frustrating about this fight is that unless you are up close and personal the entire time and exploiting the different openings, you are going to be playing keep away and waiting for a burst attack. And I recommend that you learn all of these different projectile attacks and then get up close and then get a couple hits in after that third attack because she pretty much attacks in threes. One of the things I didn't like is the special attack that she has at the start of her second phase when she goes into the waterfall into the background and then just starts shooting all these different projectiles at you. It feels like it's just a little bit too overwhelming. There's too much to block and dodge. And then you get attacked by a swarm of projectiles and then eventually a burst attack, which if you have not really timed it the first time, can be difficult to get in that counter attack. But once you get into it, the fight becomes a little bit easier. But it doesn't change the fact that Trokka will, as often as possible, try to get away from you and try to hit you with different projectiles. I think the second phase projectiles are actually easier to dodge than the first ones because the second phase projectiles, she essentially does these like floating slashes and you just need to dash into them. I could not figure that out for the life of me because I kept dashing to the left and right, which was dumb, by the way. If you just dash in front of them, eventually after that third one, she'll miss, and then she'll go to a burst attack, and then you can finish her off. And that's what I did. Easy peasy. Moving on to number 6, let's talk about Skalpel. So here's the thing. It's a matter of the second phase being annoying, but the first phase, absolutely not frustrating in the slightest. I think the first phase of this fight is fantastic. I love the fact that almost everything is guardable. You can dodge out of the way. Clear, easy tells, even with the delayed swipes. I had no trouble getting through the first phase. There might be 1 or 2 attacks that may have caught me off guard. I think the first time I saw him get on top of the coffin, that was kind of confusing until you learn that you can knock him off, which is great because if you don't, then you're just going to have him be overpowered for a brief moment and he does a ton of plague damage, so make sure you have your knight set equipped. When you get into that second phase, which they tried to pull off a little Sekiro Guardian Ape moment where he goes into the coffin, then he comes back out, and it's like mission complete, and that's obviously not true. He's a vampire. The thing about the second phase is that he's in chaos mode. And while every attack that he does essentially drains his health, he does a crap ton of damage in return. And on top of that, he is hyper aggressive. And there are certain attacks that are fully augmented to do wide AoE damage, and they can absolutely kill you in 1 or 2 hits. That can be really frustrating the first couple of times. To get it down, I had to kind of bait him into that second phase, go into my phantom form, and then hopefully just kind of manage some of these more devastating attacks until I got him back down to just kind of doing normal combo strings so I can maximize my damage output, because otherwise I was going to have a really tough time in that second phase. Chaos forms in this game can be absolutely brutal because you're not doing enough posture damage and you're barely doing enough damage as is, and this fight becomes a slog in the second phase if you are not prepared for that immediate onslaught. Love this fight. It's my favorite fight in the game, but that second phase can be a nightmare if you are not prepared and can be really, really annoying, especially when you think you're on the precipice of success. Great fight, though. At number 5, we have Viper, and in my opinion, this is probably one of the best early bosses ever in any Souls-like that I have played. And the only reason I have it at 5, because when you go throughout this game, you go and fight some of the mini bosses. Some of the mini bosses are essentially just variations of major bosses in the game. I had no problem fighting the different variations. This fight, though, 3 phases? Like, what's going on here? Early on, you don't have many skill points. You don't have really any idea of how most bosses are going to handle. And that third boss is an absolute demon. I love Viper, though. This is a fight that teaches you the meaning of being patient, going to your openings, making sure that you attack certain points of the body like the head, because you're going to do a ton of damage. Once you break his head in the first phase, it's pretty much easy coasting into that second phase. Once you get into that next phase, that next health bar, one, it is absolutely one of the coolest things I have ever seen in any game, because he just looks nightmarish the entire time. I like the fact that his attacks are readable, but if you are not used to him lunging at you 4 to 5 times, you will more than likely die during that phase early, and that's completely fine. But this is one of the coolest early fights in the game, but can be really, really frustrating, because you'll learn while playing through the First Berserker that a lot of these fights are endurance tests. And I really feel like Viper is that first big endurance test where the fight is just super long. And I really feel like the first 2 fights of the game, in which you're fighting Yeta and the Blade Phantom, do not prepare you adequately for this moment. This is a great fight. Highly cinematic, very cool, but it is a frustrating fight for a lot of people and more than likely be a wall for a little bit while you're trying to acclimate to the different systems found in this game. But I really do love the look of this fight, and I think it's one of the best early fights that I've played in any Souls-like, primarily because it really does challenge you early on. Coming in at number 4 is Aratra. Now you're probably saying to yourself, this boss wasn't hard. Ken, what are you doing? You're just making stuff up. No, this boss pissed me off. This boss took me the most tries in the game. I could not, for the life of me, up until that point, get any of my timing down at all. For some reason, every single attack that Aratra did, I could not dodge. I could barely parry. I was getting really frustrated in this fight. Plus, the fact that it coats its attacks in venom, which will kill you very quickly, is pretty frustrating given the fact that there aren't enough resources early on for you to get. And this was kind of the first time you see like these really heavy delays. Its first burst attack, in which it kind of dashes to the side and then swings its arm out for a long period of time and then eventually brings it across, that was really hard to time. Very frustrating. I just didn't like the fact that I'm going through this fight and I'm like, I just can't get it. Mostly because I hate spiders. I think that's what it was. Like, subconsciously, I was like, I don't want to fight this thing. This thing is ugly. It's nasty. But then I fought it way down the line, and I fought the Phantom boss, and I beat the absolute shit out of it. And I pretty much had to ask myself, what was the problem? Because when I was going through this fight and I'm going through my footage, I went, man, I could not dodge for shit. I could not parry. I was just kind of hoping that I could get into comfortable attack patterns that I knew, so therefore I could exploit them. But I was really frustrated because I know that watching the footage, there was a lot of times where I could have parried, played more patient, and I probably would have been okay. But this fight took me a long time, and I was very frustrated playing through it, especially because of all that venom buildup. At number 3 on this list is Ozma. So here's the thing. I love this fight. It's an awesome final fight. Surprisingly readable and fair first phase. And I mean that the first time I went in this arena, I was expecting a whole bunch of bullshit. That's all I kept saying to myself, like, I'm going to get absolutely bodied. Yes, he throws a ton of elemental attacks to you. Yes, he has a bunch of wide sweeping AoE attacks. However, they're all pretty manageable at this point, especially if you have the right armor and the right weapons. I really feel like I was having a good time in this first phase. I got caught out when he started throwing all the different chaos attacks at you when he gets into that second phase of the first fight. Now, when you get to that second fight, that can be a bit daunting, especially because of how confusing everything was. By the time I had gotten there, for some reason, I was shirtless. I don't know how that happened. My armor was gone, whatever. But as I'm sitting there watching him in his angelic Sephiroth form, I thought to myself, like, how bad can this be? And it's essentially the amount of damage that Ozma can do in the second phase, which is really frustrating, especially with his burst attack. That burst attack where he does that wide swing, once again, hardcore delay until he brings his arm down, that does a ton of damage and can kill you. What's interesting, though, is that there are a number of attacks that you can counter. When he initially tries to bring his arm down for the meteor strikes, you can block all of those to prevent those chaos meteors from actually dropping. And in fact, if you block that final delayed drop, it'll completely stun him, giving you a nice opening. But this is one of those fights where you really have to, like, pace yourself, make sure that you bring a ton of heals in, make sure that you're really patient, because when you get to that third phase, it is surprisingly easy because you can burst attack everything. It's super cinematic, super cool. Really love this final fight. He blows up in Eclipse or whatever. That was an amazing cutscene. It's fantastic. But I really feel like, to me at least, first phase, manageable. Not too bad. Okay. Second phase, can we not be like this? And then for whatever reason, the third phase was just like, let's just play more patient, get some dodges in. Took me a while, long time. Really frustrating second phase for me, at least. I was really pissed off at some points, but love this fight. Very, very cool. Coming in at the number 2 spot is Maluca. Maluca, let me explain something. I do not respect this boss, therefore I will not learn their name, but here's what I'm going to say. First phase of this fight, insanely easy. Really readable, always opens up with that spinning dash attack in midair. Super simple. Now the second phase, that's when all hell breaks loose, because if you were thinking this was going to be a walk in the park and thinking that this was going to be a really manageable fight, this fight in that second phase completely changes your mind. Because when he pulls out that katana and he starts doing all these delay slashes, the screen starts to slow down, he starts to do all this chaos attacks, like, that's when you know that this is a fight that you really have to be attentive in, otherwise you will die. I have no other explanation than, if you are not prepared to survive that initial onslaught before everything really settles down again, you are more than likely going to be about halfway through each time you get to this fight, and you're going to be burnt out, because this is one of the first fights where I feel like you're really overwhelmed with the amount of attacks the boss can do, and that to me was really frustrating, because for the most part, first phase, super easy manageable. Second phase, that initial onslaught is daunting. But once he stops going crazy, you can just kind of hang out, do a couple of attacks here and there, and then just regroup, right? That's how I felt about the entire time. My entire job was to survive, get him into all these different attacks, and then continuously move forward. This is the boss that made me switch off the spear, by the way. I went to the greatsword because I wanted to do more damage, and I also wanted to get a little bit better in regards to defense. But I really love this fight. Love the look of it. Hate the absolute second phase, because the start of it, especially when you're first getting into this fight, you are not warmed up. The first part of this fight does not warm you up in the slightest. That second phase, though, is an absolute killer and frustrated the shit out of me. I think I took, like, I don't know, 15 to 20 tries to beat this boss, because I was just so mad at every time I missed a counter and every time he went into that heavy flourish. Just intensely frustrating. But great fight nonetheless. And coming in at number 1 is Elamein. So, I just want to say that it's probably going to surprise anyone who watches this video. This was the number 1 boss that I absolutely hated fighting. I could not stand this fight. I'm serious. I hated this fight primarily because the fact that it felt inconsistent when you were going up for a follow attack. So for example, she would do that hard dash with her shield, I would lunge in for a heart attack to her back and then immediately try to get a follow-up because I'm able to. She would immediately block. And there were multiple occasions where I thought I would get to her side after she had committed multiple attacks where she would just pull up her shield and block. So not only can you not attack from the front, you just don't have time because most shielded enemies in this game, you're allowed to break their posture. That's part of their gimmick. Here, you cannot do that. And when she starts to create distance from you when she's low on stamina and she throws her shield at you and you have to kind of sprint all the way back there, by the time you get there, she's already in a defensive posture and her stamina's all the way back. That is intensely frustrating. This fight goes on for way too long. This is an endurance fight that I just did not have fun in the slightest. Even though I really like Elamein's character, I just felt like this fight itself was a bit longer than I expected, and the fact that she just keeps running away and then blocking everything. It's one of those fights where I expected better, but was just frustrated. I think the second phase, even with the increased aggression, the fact that she can still parry damn near everything, take no damage at all, is something that I'm just not a big fan of. And I felt like the hitbox was also frustrating because, you know, like I said, you go from the side, you're trying to hit on the left or right, and it's immediately blocked, even if you have those follow-ups. Most bosses in this game, once you get them kind of stun locked, they will allow you to follow up with multiple combos. Elamein is an example in which you can get them once, stagger them, and then they immediately go into a defensive posture, which is really, really frustrating because it really slows down the flow of the fight. I understand that most fights in this game are meant to be a challenge, and most fights in this game can be really fun. This fight, to me, I did not like in the slightest. It's the one fight where I just became annoyed the longer the fight went along, and the fact that every time I looked for an opening, I just couldn't find it because she'd go into a flurry attack and then immediately turtle up to dodge, and then you just can't break the stamina down. That was annoying as shit. And the fact that you just can't chase this boss. You can't. Even when I had good follow-ups, I was like, okay, I'll get her with an overhead attack. And then she just blocks immediately. I'm like, all right, well, what's the point? It's a patient, slow fight. I understand there's drama there. But once again, it's just not a fun fight. It was boring, and it just took far too long. And that's probably going to surprise people, but that's probably the worst fight in the game for me by far. I just did not have fun in this fight, even though there are some really cool attacks. And that's going to do it for this video. So let me know in the comments what your favorite boss is. What's the boss that annoys you the most? And let me know what you think about the rankings in general. If you happen to like the content, please consider like, sharing, and subscribing. I am Ken from Pixelated Thoughts, and I will talk to you next time.